Right. Hi, and thank you for tuning in for a presentation hosted by the Donedo Career Center here at the UT School of Social Work. My name is Sam. I'm a writing coordinator for the Donedo Center, and this presentation is about academic honesty, sometimes also referred to as academic integrity, or plagiarism, how to avoid plagiarism, what it means to commit unintentional plagiarism, and how we navigate the conversation around plagiarism if it comes up in our lives. I've broken this presentation down according to three major discussion questions. One is simply, what is plagiarism exactly? The definition is sometimes more complicated than we think. Why is plagiarism bad, sociologically, culturally, ethically? And then finally, how do we discuss plagiarism with others? Many of you are probably going to be going into educational fields. You may be in situations with your current peers and classmates where you'll have to have conversations about either avoiding plagiarism or citing your work properly in order to avoid the appearance of plagiarism. And so hopefully that question among these other two will be useful to you as you move forward here at UT and beyond. So here at the School of Social Work, you may come across these three places when you are looking into what plagiarism is, what qualifies as plagiarism for you as a social work student. The first is the NASW Code of Ethics, which the Standards for Social Work Education Handbook, a PDF available online, makes a note of, and their definition of plagiarism, or at least the moment when they mention dishonesty, is here. They say social workers should not participate in, condone, or be associated with dishonesty, fraud, or deception. Pretty straightforward, but you may then be wondering, okay, well, what counts as dishonesty? What is fraud? How do I avoid deception in my work if I'm not necessarily attempting to be dishonest, but something may be perceived dishonestly, right? So if you go to the Standards for Social Work Education PDF, you find the following: that students in the School of Social Work must demonstrate honesty and integrity by being truthful about their background, experiences, and qualifications, doing one's own work, giving credit for the ideas of others, and providing proper citation of source materials. So this definition, at least as far as plagiarism is concerned, is a little more specific and a little more appropriate to the kind of work y'all are going to be doing in your classes, right? But it's still difficult to know, for example, what a proper citation looks like when there are so many competing definitions of what that means. And again, what we mean by honesty and integrity. So the Standards for Social Work Education refers to the UT Handbook, a very, very long contractual document that you can also find online, Appendix C 11-401, Section D. And there you'll find the following university-wide definition of plagiarism, which is that plagiarism includes, but is not limited to, the appropriation of, buying, receiving as a gift, or obtaining by any means material that is attributable in whole or in part to another source without any indication of the original source, including words, ideas, illustrations, structure, computer code, and other expressions or media, and presenting that material as one's own academic work, being offered for credit or in conjunction with a program, course, or degree requirements. So if you've had a writing consultation with me, you may have heard me say that my rule of thumb for sentence length is 3 lines, no longer. Of course, this is contractual language, so a different genre allows for a little more extensive sentence work. It also allows for a little convolution, right? This is very thorough, but it's maybe not the most accessible place to learn about what plagiarism is and how to parse what is and isn't plagiarism in our work. So my hope is that this presentation breaks down that language a little bit. Here are some definitions of plagiarism that we may go to first or be most familiar with. The first is very simply turning in work that was written by someone else, right? Simple. Copying and pasting sentences or sections from work written by someone else into our own work. Paying a service to produce an assignment, we all know that's wrong. Including research without citing the researcher, right? These are definitely definitions of plagiarism. But here are some that are maybe less familiar to us, or that we think of less than we do those others. The first is turning in the same paper for credit in separate classes. I didn't know that this was an act or an expression of plagiarism until I came to UT. Paraphrasing or rewording information from an outside source without a citation is also considered plagiarism. Even if you are, that is, rephrasing your language that you borrowed from a source, the idea itself needs to be cited. Imitating the structure or order of an outside source without a citation is plagiarism. I didn't know that one either. And then the last is providing definitions or what we think is common knowledge without citations. That is, if you cite a historical fact in your paper or your research, if you cite a definition of a term that you think your audience needs, that definition needs to come from somewhere. If we weren't born with that information on hand, then we need to be able to cite it somewhere because we're probably borrowing specific language that someone else has used to define that term. We're also helping our reader understand that we're a credible source and that we've done our research into what a term means or how a fact is or isn't credible. So my first more conceptual discussion question for you is, why is plagiarism bad? This might seem, again, like a pretty simplistic question, but if you really think about it for a minute, the answer is perhaps more complicated. So because this is a panoptic video, I'll invite you to pause for a moment if you'll indulge me in something kind of hokey, and just think about how you would answer this question if someone asked you. Okay, here's what comes to mind for me. Plagiarism is really, really difficult to define and to respond to. It's difficult in some cases to avoid because although the conversation about plagiarism is often about criminality and shame, we get all of these mixed messages from the culture around us, sometimes from other jobs that we've had before graduate school, sometimes within graduate school, about what it means to be ambitious, strategic, how to be smart, quote unquote, about certain career choices and moves that will help us stand out in the crowd. For example, I went to a Q&A workshop session with some previous alums in my program. I'm from the Department of English, and there were a few others as well who were contacts of contacts. Someone at that workshop who was speaking was helping us put together teaching statements and giving us advice on how to compose a portfolio of teaching materials and syllabi. And this person told us all that he thought it was most strategic if we took syllabi from others. I think he very cheekily but actually used the word stole, and told the people who were interviewing us that those materials were our own. I think the way he phrased it was, if you can teach it, act as though you've taught it. So if we're getting messages like this anywhere, on campus, off campus, from our colleagues, from the internet, then it starts to become really difficult to know whether we're the only ones worried about ethics in certain cases, or whether everyone is equally worried about plagiarism and what it means to be honest. Sometimes knowing the difference between dishonesty and getting ahead is then compromised, right? Being able to understand that difference is compromised. We're also not always encouraged to remember that scholarship is a collaborative effort, right? We feel such a pressure to master a subject, to be the new innovative voice, to say something that no one has ever said before, that sometimes we're not as encouraged as we should be to lean on others in order to produce information, because all of scholarship is that way. All of scholarship is collaborative. And so I think the sooner we remind ourselves, and the more often we remind ourselves, that we should be proud of the reading that we've done. We should be proud of the collaborative work we've done, integrating other voices into our work in order to refine and expand our knowledge. The easier it'll be for us to prioritize and privilege what it means to cite others appropriately in the first place. So let's say that you are accused of plagiarism. Hopefully it never happens, but you should know what will happen if it does. There's a 3-level review process within the School of Social Work. The first level is that a faculty member will meet with you in order to discuss your suspected dishonest conduct. Often, the dispute is resolved at this level, so you might meet with the faculty person who thinks that you plagiarized in a paper or in an assignment. You discuss together what that faculty member thinks is appropriate, and then as long as you are able to navigate that conversation gracefully, say, hey, I'm really sorry, I didn't realize that I was doing this, or here's what happened, and as a result, I did this. It's very possible that things end there. If that conversation does not go well for whatever reason, then that conversation is moved to a larger conversation between you, the faculty member, and the assistant dean, at which point you may produce something in writing. This is all from the Standards of Social Work Education again. And that might be a sort of contractual document stating that you don't intend to commit plagiarism again. This is really if you are a repeated offender, right? If plagiarism is something that seems to be a habit that your faculty member feels is coming up again and again, and that first conversation didn't really seem to hold anything for you. If things advance beyond that, you go to level 3. This means that you meet with a larger group of faculty, possibly other faculty who you've worked with in the past or who have taught other classes that you've been in. And you also meet with the senior associate dean or other people in comparable positions to discuss the possibility of withdrawal. It's important to know that this is a possibility because it foregrounds and enforces that plagiarism is really, really important, not only to avoid, but also to understand thoroughly, right? Hopefully, it will never, ever get there for you, right? This is sort of a rare circumstance, but it's important to know that it's there. So here are some handy tips and tricks for avoiding unintentional plagiarism. The first is very simple. When in doubt, cite. It's much better to have an oversighted document than one that lacks proper citations. So anytime you have information in a piece of writing that you think could possibly be attributable to an outside source, even if you haven't quoted anybody in a long time, make sure that you're doing due diligence because your faculty person or your instructor can always talk to you about where to cut citations, and that won't result in any kind of disciplinary action or awkward conversation. The second thing is my personal favorite, and it's to keep a log of sources you've consulted, even if you haven't taken any quotes from them. Often what happens to me while I write is I read a lot, I make a kind of mental list of sources that I don't actually think I'm going to need, even after reading them, and then somehow or other, my lizard brain still puts that source in my writing somehow. That is, sometimes we learn ideas from others, and those ideas end up in our paper, even if we are not aware that that is where they came from, right? That is, even if we're not aware that they came from the reading that we've done. So to avoid the possibility of that happening, keep a log of the sources that you read, even if they don't end up in your eventual work cited, because you may find going back through your paper that some idea or another is actually correct to cite from a source that you didn't actually end up thinking that you would use. The third thing is to cross-check your works cited or bibliography by term searching your document. So if you have a Mac and you use Command-Shift-F, you can term search your document, which means that a little bar pops up in your Word document or your Google Doc, whatever it is that you use, and you can actually type in names of authors, names of sources, ideas, and make sure that everything that is in your bibliography or works cited appears in the body of the paper somewhere, either by parenthetical citation or otherwise, right? And then the last is simply to produce new work every time you submit an assignment, it can be frustrating to feel like in each of your classes you are working toward some larger goal, right, or refining some larger research interest. Sometimes you end up with an assignment across classes that feels like you're just being asked to produce the same kind of work all over again. But it can actually be really serious if you submit the same paper across two classes. So as much as possible, avoid the trouble of going through the plagiarism review process and enjoy the experience, if possible, of expanding your knowledge and producing new work. So here's my last big discussion question, which is, how do we talk about plagiarism with others? I've included this question because I've been a teaching assistant, for example. I've had to have a lot of potentially awkward conversations with my students. But because I know y'all in the School of Social Work are often writing group papers, I imagine you're also in a position where you may have to have this conversation with each other, which does not sound fun, right? So, like in the case of the previous question, if you feel like it, you might pause this video and just think about how you would respond to this question, how you would have this conversation with anybody that you needed to. Here are some basic guidelines that I'm sure social work students are already more than equipped to have come to on their own. The first is to proceed with empathy. People don't always commit academic dishonesty on purpose. As we've previously discussed, it's often unintentional. It's often just a matter of not understanding what does and doesn't qualify as plagiarism. So if you are working with a student or a peer, it's better to avoid asking them to confess or being aggressive, and much better to tell them that you're concerned that they may be in trouble or that they may get you in trouble, right, if you're working on a group assignment together. The second guideline is to ask questions, especially if you're working with a student and you feel that they've committed plagiarism. My rule of thumb is to begin by seeing if something is up, if it seems like it's appropriate, right? Usually, maybe 99% of the time, the student is really stressed out by something in their life. And if they did commit intentional plagiarism, it's because they really hoped they wouldn't get caught and they felt really bad about it, but they were just going through something and they made that call. It's good to have that context, right? Because then the student is a little more comfortable discussing that issue with you, and maybe you can connect them to further resources. If you're working with a peer, this goes pretty much the same, right? It's good just to get context. It's good to figure out what led them from point A to point B and give them a space to discuss the experience from their own perspective so that you know how to act and what to say going forward and don't have to worry that you're making assumptions. The last is just to set that person up for success. See if you can diagnose the problem, what kind of plagiarism it seems they've committed, and then suggest what to do going forward. For example, maybe the person you're working with has just paraphrased a little too closely to the original language in the quote that they're trying to reword. And the solution there is just to reword the quote a little further, to include a parenthetical citation, or to actually include language from the piece that they're working with. Here are some ways to make sure that you are citing your sources properly. Beyond that works cited list or that bibliography, there are, as many of you already know, all of these ways to make sure that your sources are correctly cited throughout the actual document. The first is called an attributional phrase. That simply means that you are using the author's name or the name of the source somewhere in the actual sentence that you're putting them into. So you might say something like, according to Brown, right? As Smith writes in insert source here, right? Etc., etc. The second is probably going to be the one that people are most familiar with, and that's to use parenthetical citations. This is a brief reference to a source in parentheses at the end of a sentence. According to APA, you can put the date in parentheses the first time you reference an author's name. So that might look like, according to Brown, who was writing in 2018, put that in parentheses. Writing is easier if we break down the process. The last kind of citation practice on this slide, and then I have a few on the next, is called a block quote citation. You use a block quote citation if you have a really, really long quote, which many of you may have been discouraged from using at all. This is a way to get away with doing it properly. You put that long quote in a block quote formation, which means that you indent each line, you single space it if the rest of your document is double spaced, and then you have your parenthetical citation at the end, even though you don't have quotation marks around the block quote. And I encourage you to look up examples of that online, just so that you can see how it looks on the page. That is a nice way to really dive deeply into a longer segment of information in a source if you need to. Here are just a few others you may be familiar with. The first is called an introductory citation. This is kind of like an attributional phrase. This is just a reminder that anytime you introduce a source for the first time, you may end up citing it in the body of the paper a little more extensively than you would otherwise going forward in the paper, right? So you might represent that source according to its author, the title of the work, the date that it was published, etc., in order to really foreground for the reader that this is an important part of your research going forward. The last two are footnotes and endnotes. People tend to get footnotes and endnotes confused. I know I did when I came to graduate school. The first footnotes is a series of marks throughout the document that then appear as a note at the bottom of each page. So you may be used to seeing a 1 after a piece of information in a source, and then that 1 corresponds to a 1 at the bottom of the document with more information, 2, 3, etc. Right? And those notes are there to provide your reader further context, in some cases to give them reference for materials they can read outside of your research, anything that isn't strictly relevant to the argument that you're making, but that may provide extra information and be interesting to the reader as they move through your piece. The second type, endnotes, is somewhat like a footnote. An endnote also relies on markings made throughout the piece that you're working on, but all of those notes appear at the end of the document, that is in bulk at the end of the piece that you're working on, and not at the bottom of each page. You can use either footnotes or endnotes. It really just depends on your preference. Sometimes if you're publishing a journal article, for example, it depends on the preference of the publisher, how it looks on the page, right? How much time they want to spend on each page, on a different case of font even. But the rule of thumb is not to mix them, whichever you end up using. So earlier I mentioned that paraphrasing unclearly might be a way to commit plagiarism without intending to. And I want to linger on that point for a moment because it's one of the easiest ways to quote-unquote commit plagiarism without realizing it, right? There are a lot of ways to cite a text in a document and still commit plagiarism because you're not citing the correct language or citing where you think you may not need to. So here are some examples of paraphrasing clearly and then some examples of paraphrasing a little less clearly. Let's say you're reading this fake book, Social Work Education, a guide, written by this author named Longhorn, and you want to say something like this. In Social Work Education, a guide, Longhorn writes that social work programs often provide students with internship opportunities. This is a complete paraphrase of what we have to imagine is material that could have been quoted, and this is a good paraphrase because if you look at the following example, which does include a quote, that actual original language reads, regularly equip grad students with practical experience in the field, including internships. So you'll see that the difference between the paraphrased line and the line that includes a quote is that the same idea is communicated, but the language is quite different, right? You can use either of these two models. The rule of thumb that I practice for quoting is that if I feel the language is significant to what I am trying to say, that is the precise language that the author used is important to the point that I want to make, I'm interested in the phrasing, regularly equip, then I might include a quote instead. You might also just find that an author makes a point really, really clearly in the original language that they've used, and you'd like to include it there for reference. Either way, it's totally fine, absolutely fine and in many ways advantageous to use quotes from the sources that you use. But you can also paraphrase. For example, if you feel the idea is kind of long and complicated and you want to summarize it so that you can move on to a point that may be more important to the overall project that you're working on. Here are some examples of less clear paraphrasing practices. Let's say you do the following. In Social Work Education, a guide, Longhorn writes that social work programs regularly equip grad students with practical experience, quote, in the field, including internships. Okay, so maybe you've decided that you want to highlight this language, in the field, including internships. That's fine, but you've pretended, without necessarily meaning to pretend, to have come up with the phrase, regularly equip grad students with practical experience. So make sure that if you find yourself in a position where you're just focused on quoting certain information, you are changing the language around other information and providing a parenthetical citation anyway, because you're taking this information from a source, whether it's the idea that you're taking or the quote itself. The same goes for the second unclear example. Research suggests that social work programs regularly equip grad students with opportunities to work as interns. This is another paraphrase. Some of the language has been changed, but not all of it. There's also a citation, so you may wonder why this isn't more than adequate. Look at all of the information in those parentheses. You have, again, used the language from that original quote, so you would just need to change it a little bit, maintain that parenthetical citation, make sure that everything there really is your own writing, and that you're not parroting the order or the actual language in the sentence, even with that citation. If you have any questions about this presentation, please feel free to reach out to us directly. You can reach out to me, this is my email address on the first line, or you can reach out to the Donito Center, and we are happy to answer any questions you might have or help you via writing consultation as you submit your work and make sure that you are practicing academic honesty. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you again for joining us.